Hello, welcome to the first introductory video for Systems 552, Biology 487, Computational Neuroscience. It's being taught in the winter of 2021. I'm Terry Stewart. I'll be co-teaching this along with Michael Furlong. Welcome. Just to give a little bit of background about who I am. My undergrad is from Systems here at Waterloo. I did my PhD in cognitive science at Carleton University in Ottawa. My focus there was on how computational modeling should be used in cognitive science in general. So in terms of just understanding human behavior. And then I did about 10 years as a postdoc at the Center for Theoretical Neuroscience here at the University of Waterloo, where the focus there was computational models of neuroscience systems, so doing computer simulations of brains. Currently, I'm a research officer at the National Research Council of Canada. NRC is a government research lab, and so as a research officer, I'm basically a full-time researcher. And normally, NRC is mostly housed in Ottawa and a bunch of other places around Canada. I'm part of the new thing they're trying where I'm part of the University of Waterloo Collaboration Center. So I'm here at the University of Waterloo physically, and I'm supposed to be collaborating with people here. And I'm continuing to do the same sort of work I was doing with my postdoc, so large-scale brain simulations, and there's a particular emphasis on can we make use of what we're learning about the brain in order to make computing hardware more energy efficient, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. All right, so that's me, and then there's also Michael, who is co-teaching as well. He does have another video to just introduce himself, but I will start just to briefly mention undergrad, Memorial University of Newfoundland, Masters in Neuroscience at Oxford, PhD in robotics, CMU, and then was at the NASA Ames Intelligent Robotics Group, building robots for space, because hey, why not? I hired him away from that to come join me as a postdoc at the Center for Theoretical Neuroscience, where his focus is on having neural networks that learn about the dynamics of a system, like learning about how our robot arm moves and things like that. Cool. So that's us and why we have a little bit of background to be teaching such a course like this. I'm going to highlight the few things just to give some context of where I'm coming from. This video that you're seeing here is some work that we published back in 2012. Which at the time was the world's largest brain simulation. It is still the world's largest functional brain simulation, so a brain simulation that actually does something. And in this particular, it's still the world's largest functional brain simulation. And the particular thing that it was doing there, I'll just play that video again, is it's being shown a sequence of numbers, 0, 1, 5, 8, 7, and 3. It has to remember those numbers, and then when it sees the question mark, it needs to write them back out again. So it needs to both remember that information, it needs to be able to control its robot arm, and you can see the muscles being contracted and whatnot to make the arm move. All the sort of the neural modeling inside is sort of mapped onto the biology of the brain, and the really interesting thing to me is if we're getting that right, it should make the same sorts of mistakes that people make, and indeed, in that particular case there, it forgot the item in the middle of the list, and that's a common pattern in people, is to remember the beginnings and ends of lists much more readily than the middle. Very nifty large-scale computer simulation. We'll touch a little bit on the particular techniques that were used for that video or for that model. There is a full course on it, Systems 556. Unfortunately, it's not being taught this term, anyway, there's a bunch of, we'll at least point you to resources in that sort of direction if that's the sort of thing that is of interest. So that's sort of, to me, that's sort of the core of what I want to do, is building these big brain simulations. It's turned out more and more that as I get into building these brain simulations, I need specialized hardware, because traditional computing hardware is not particularly well suited for doing really large neuron simulations. I've got videos there of 3 different groups that are building different sorts of hardware that are the sort of brain-inspired, or what they call neuromorphic hardware. And so these are all people that I've worked closely with over the last 10 years or so. Steve Ferber on the left is one of the initial developers of the ARM processor, and he's having lots of fun taking a whole bunch of ARM processors and stripping them down to just the bare minimum that you need to simulate neurons, and cramming boards full of those chips. In the middle there is Kwabena Bohane and Rajit Manohar, who helped develop an analog neuromorphic chip, so it's all analog hardware, even more energy efficient that way. That was development out of Yale and Stanford, I guess Cornell at the time, whatever. Stanford and Cornell, although Rajit is now at Yale. It's very complicated. In any case, and on the far right there is Mike Davies, who is part of the Intel Luihi team, and that's a team making neuromorphic hardware at Intel. In particular, this is a chip that they developed that is very specialized in making actually quite a wide variety of interesting neuron models. And so all of these people have developed all this really cool hardware, and then where my role has been to go, okay, this hardware exists, or I get to have some sort of influence maybe on how the hardware is developed, but then the core of it is, once you've got this hardware, how do you program it? And to me, that becomes a very similar question of, I'm trying to take all the information I'm learning about how brains manage to get programmed. How do you manage to get brains to do interesting things? And now we've got this neurally inspired hardware. We can use a lot of those same techniques to program this hardware. All right. Oh, and then as a result of all that is you get a lot of energy efficiency advantages and industry advantages and things like that. I will also comment that since I've started interacting with sort of neuromorphic hardware community, it's been a lot easier to get funding, because I can actually point to something and say, hey, look, we can make things more energy efficient, as opposed to a more abstract goal like, hey, maybe we can understand how brains work. In any case, but that's been a big part of what I have been doing. Another big aspect of what I've been doing is started a startup company. So there's a startup company out of the University of Waterloo called Applied Brain Research. Myself, Chris Eliasmith, who was the prof that I was working with during my postdoc, and 5 PhD students. We ended up starting a company called Applied Brain Research, and the goal there is to take all of this stuff about how brains compute and try to find industry applications for it. That's Chris, who just walked into the video there. The company itself is doing a wide variety of things. This particular one that this video is showing is trying to do robot control with a little neural network. Right now it's being demonstrated that in standard robot control, all right, you get really, really stiff arms, and those are sort of really dangerous because the arm just sort of goes to where you want. There's a thing called compliant robotic control where it just sort of applies the right amount of force to go to where it's supposed to go. And so, yeah, that's much safer to be around. That's great. Everyone wants that. The problem with compliant control, though, is that if you give the robot arm an unexpected weight, it no longer knows how much force to apply, and now just sort of totally misses where it's supposed to go. And that's not all that useful. Well, it's great if you know absolutely everything that's going on, but if anything unexpected goes on, it's not all that useful. This particular application that we've been showing at Applied Brain Research is that, hey, if you take a pretty simple learning rule, embed it in a neural network, then you can actually have the robot arm sort of learn to compensate for that extra force. This ends up, the work for this, or the theory, underlying theory for this, ended up coming partly out of one of the PhD students in the lab, Travis DeWolf, which was sort of partly inspired by the cerebellum, a part of the brain that's very involved in these sorts of tasks, and also partly inspired by adaptive control theory from Jean-Jacques Slotine, sort of late 80s, and sort of taking that and reformulating that as a neural network system. In any case, that's one particular application. The idea with that is if you have a robot arm that can now sort of do that sort of safe adaptation, you also have the advantage of you can do things like have it adapt to gradual wear and tear on the arm itself. So as the motors wear down, there's friction changes, and you need to apply different apply forces differently, and so you want to be able to adapt to that sort of thing without having to recalibrate the entire controller and basically have the controller calibrate itself. So that's one particular application that's been looked at, applied brain research. Lots of other ones have been looking at into things like voice recognition and spatial representations and just all sorts of other things. But the emphasis there is, can we show that these neural networks give some sort of advantage to industry? Cool. So yeah, that company exists, and all sorts of fun stuff happening with that. All right, so that's a whole bunch of where I'm coming from and why you should vaguely listen to what I have to say about computational neuroscience. Now I should probably define what computational neuroscience is. So I guess there's two sort of big aspects here. There's two directions to think about it. One is using computation to investigate neurons. So what does computation tell us about neuroscience? So a lot of that would be, let's take a biological system, let's build a computer simulation of it, let's make sure that, by building that computer simulation, we can make sure that we actually understand all the different aspects of the biological system, see how it would behave in new situations, just understand how all the different components interact. So that's one aspect. And then there's also this aspect that's maybe a little more surprising, which is we can use neurons to investigate computation. What do we mean by that? Neurons and how neurons actually compute things is wildly different from how traditional computers and traditional like von Neumann or Turing computers. So like the standard approach for computing that all of modern technology is built on is taking a wildly different approach to computation than what biology did. And I think that's a fascinating difference. And I think that can sort of change how we think about computation. So both of those are to me interesting goals or interesting ways to look at it. I suppose there are different aspects of computational neuroscience. Why do it is also, I think, another interesting question. So why should we do computational neuroscience? And there's a wide variety of answers to this. I'm just going to sort of randomly scatter a bunch of things that sort of come to mind for me. Brains are completely fascinating. So just for context, I don't understand why anyone studies anything else. Why do people study? Anyway, I find brains absolutely fascinating. The most complex thing that there is, or arguably the most complex thing that there is out there to study. It's really fundamental to who we are, and I think because it's so complicated, you really need to do some sort of computational modeling in order to test any complicated theory. So it's very hard to do strong theories about how brains work if you're not building computational models of those ideas. So that's one aspect. There's also this weird energy efficiency aspect, and just to really put it into scale here, total power consumption of the human brain is about 20 watts. If I wanted to use modern computational hardware, so GPUs, even good energy efficient GPUs, and make the simplest possible model of a brain where there's like one equation per neuron, and I wanted to run that, I'd need something like 2 billion watts, 2 gigawatts of power. That's a ridiculous scale difference. That's what? No. Something very different is happening there. And then to combine that with the aspect I just mentioned of, look, the algorithms that brains use are just so different from standard computing algorithms that I think there's so many interesting things to discover about where that energy efficiency is coming from. There's also a bunch of things where it's just important to understand how brains work. drugs, aging, damage, all of those sorts of things, trying to understand what those things do to a brain, and developing new medical treatments, those sorts of things. In the long run, understanding of the brain really should help with these things. I think there's an interesting question about whether it helps now, but in the long run, that feels like that's just something that should really help. And in particular, I've got a strong, or sort of more interest in things like human decision making and biases and prejudices and the underlying processes that can arise or can lead to those sorts of aspects. Cool. And then there's this sort of practical sort of engineering, good capitalist answer of, hey, look, if I can understand how brains do these things, there's all sorts of cool industry reasons to do that. So image recognition, voice recognition, language translation. There's just tons of examples out there right now of neural networks being used in lots and lots of different applications. Brains do a lot of different things. If we can understand how the brains do those things, there seems to be good, useful things you could do with that. Cool. All right. So I've been preaching to the choir because you've all, decided to take a course called Computational Neuroscience. But I do also, I think it's still, I'm not trying to convince you that computational neuroscience is interesting, but I do want to, I hope from that list there was lots of different ways that people might find it interesting, because I do find that people in this course and people doing computational neuroscience can often be very interested in some of those things, but not necessarily others of those things. My personal interests are sort of randomly scattered across all of that. So, in any case, all right. How are we going to organize this course? Because that was just way too much stuff to cover. So we're going to start with this diagram, and it's sort of like this diagram I think shows up in every talk, every course on computational neuroscience. At some point, this particular diagram gets shown. Mostly because it's highlighting the scale problem that's got to happen when dealing with computational neuroscience. What we've on the left-hand side, we got sort of labels of different scales, different spatial scales. From at the top here, we're talking about the central nervous system, and sort of the middle, we're looking at just sort of individual networks of neurons and individual neurons, down to individual molecules. On the right, we've sort of this visual depiction. So this top here, this is sort of, here's a bunch of different brain areas and how they're connected to each other. In the middle, we've got, here's a bunch of different neurons and how the neurons are connected to each other. And at the bottom, we've got sort of a zoom in of, okay, what are those connections between neurons? What the heck is actually happening there? And there's a huge scale problem here. And in fact, this diagram even sort of hides the scale problem a little bit, because not all of those steps are the same size. So I'm going to change the diagram a little bit. So now each step is an order of magnitude, so a factor of 10. And I'm going to fill in those empty boxes. So there's a large range of things to deal with, like, the way neurons, actually understanding how neurons work involves dealing with individual molecules. And that's at the very bottom there. There's different types of proteins, very large molecules building up. There's synapses, how the neurons connect to each other. There's components within the neurons, organelles. There's the neurons themselves. There's small networks of those neurons. There's big networks of those neurons, whole brain systems, and then there's the whole central nervous system. That's a mess. What are we going to do? Basically what we're going to do is we're just going to come back to this diagram as sort of a reminder as we're going through the course. And we're going to somewhat, at each point in the course, we're going to be sort of shifting around whether we're focused on the biology side or we're focused on the artificial neural network side. And we'll definitely be moving back and forth a lot, but it helps us sort of keep track of where we are. We're going to start just talking about individual neurons, because that sort of seems like a good place to start. We'll then do a wild, fast overview of the entire central nervous system. It's just like, okay, brains, there's a bunch of stuff. And that's sort of more just to give, brains are really complicated. Let's at least get some of the basic terminology out there. Different common brain areas, just because it's going to come up later on. We're then going to sort of move over to the artificial side and say, okay, where do people start trying to build these computational models? How do people start trying to build computer systems that look like brains? perceptrons, linear regression, so some basic techniques that people are using. That's going to build up to the backpropagation learning algorithm, and how that lets you start dealing with larger scale systems and more neurons. We're then going to move up even higher into convolution, convolutional neural networks. The combination of backpropagation and convolutional neural networks is basically the core behind the modern explosion in machine learning. Well, the combination of those two things plus having large GPUs. That sort of is what led to modern machine learning. We'll then talk a little bit about complexities to deal with in that in those sorts of situations. So dealing with how do you configure your models, how do you adjust parameters and hyperparameters in your model. We'll also start talking about how you take those sorts of standard learning things and adapt them a little bit in order to do things like unsupervised learning and reinforcement learning. But then we're going to sort of pull it back to the biology side and say, okay, hold on a second. Well, right, we've got a good sense of how people are using these computational neuroscience type models. Let's go back to the biology. Given what we've now understood, talk about how the low-level visual system works, build up to the intermediate and high-level visual systems, and particularly try to relate what the biological systems are doing to the things that we've covered on the more artificial neural network side. Then we're going to step down the scale a little bit, start looking at individual neuron models, Hodgkin-Huxley models, compartmental models, individual synapses, start talking about this sort of more low-level biological stuff, a lot of which are things that are sort of ignored in the artificial neural network type literature. And then we'll sort of bring it back onto the artificial side and say, are there ways of taking these sorts of more biological details and trying to make use of them a little bit in the artificial neural network side? And that'll be the neural engineering framework stuff. That's the connection to the core research that I've been doing over the last 10 years or so. Finally, given that'll get sorts of all the core content of the course, and then we're going to, whatever time we have left, let's just talk about ongoing research in these different areas, because there's a bunch of researchers here at Waterloo that are doing ongoing leading edge research on exactly this sort of stuff. So we'll try to give a sense of what all is going on there. And we'll see how that goes. All right. Course objectives. What do I want you to get out of this course? Here's my basic minimum. I want you to be able to implement and code a artificial neural network from scratch. Just sort of, okay, can you actually build the core ideas there? I also want you to be able to train a deep convolutional network. So that's sort of like the standard basic approach of deep machine learning, the thing that is often compared to a biological visual system. We won't be doing that from scratch. We'll be using existing Python tools for that, just because if you write that yourself from scratch, it'll just run really, really slowly. So you want to be able to, the networks start being large, so you want to be able to make use of existing software and hardware. So that's sort of the core things I want on the artificial side. On the biological side, I want you to at least be able to describe sort of how does the primate visual system work. Certainly not, I don't expect you to know how the entire brain, the standard approaches for what the entire brain does. That's just way the heck outside of the scope of this course. But at least the visual system, I think, has some nice direct comparisons to convolutional neural networks. So to be able to do that comparison. And I also want you to be able to do a more detailed biological simulations. So I want you to do a computational neuroscience models of, here's a much more detailed neuron model. That should be quite a different sort of thing than the standard artificial neural network model. So that's what I want you to get out of it. There's going to be 4 assignments in the course, and the 4 assignments are going to cover those 4 things. We'll talk about the assignments in a moment. There's no textbook required with the course. I'll just be posting readings to the Learn website. And most of them are from Kandel et al., Principles of Neuroscience, a few from other sources. There's going to be some short excerpts from a whole bunch of different things. The evaluation, as I said, there's 4 assignments, and 3 of those assignments are going to be programming assignments, so you will actually have to be writing code. You can do it in any language you want. I will recommend Python because that's what I'll be giving examples in, or at least how I'll be framing the assignments. The assignment 3 is just going to be more of a short answer sort of assignment. There is also, instead of a final exam, there is going to be a final project. The final project is also going to involve some programming. There's going to be, and basically you're going to have free reign for what topic you're going to do for that final assignment, and we will have examples of potential final assignments throughout the course. You'll have to pick one by March 9th and submit a little project proposal, get that approved, and then do a project. The projects can be done in groups of at most 2. The particular, some example projects, here's some data, train a neural network to classify it. Here's a paper about some biological neuron model, write a computer simulation that implements that. Here's a simple little task, build a small little neural circuit that does that task. Again, I'll sort of, at the end of each video lecture, we'll post, here's some particular things that might come to mind that you might do for a final project. Finally, how are we going to teach this, given this whole online teaching thing? What we're going to do is I'm going to post videos and the slides for the videos. Some will be done by me, some will be done by Michael. We're going to be doing 2 videos per week. I'm going to aim to have them posted on Sunday, but some, they might also slip to Monday, like this very first one is. And then it's for sort of asynchronous sort of interaction. Post questions on the video itself, or that's for if you're okay with the questions being public, just post them right on the video comments themselves. Or if you prefer private questions, email both myself and Michael, and we'll do it that way. But then we're going to have 2 synchronous sessions a week. There's the Tuesdays 2 o'clock to 3:20 slot in the virtual classroom. We're going to, and the plan for that is, since the videos will be posted before that, we're going to do a fast overview of the videos. So a fast overview of the slides anyway, with the intent there is that we can either go through all the slides and then discuss, or interrupt me in the middle of that fast overview and say, okay, hold on, let's go into more detail there. So that's the goal for Tuesday. And then Thursday, again, we've got there's more things in the virtual classroom. That's meant to be a tutorial slot, so that's meant to be more specific questions about assignments, but can also be just a general discussion about the topics in the videos. So that's how we're going to do this. Hopefully that'll all work. Look forward to giving this a try. This is my first time teaching with this sort of style, so we will see how this goes. And thank you very much for your interest, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye.